Howdy, folks. I wanted to just drop in here before the episode and say a big thank you to everybody who is supporting the Patreon. What this means is, at this point, our first goal of providing transcriptions for everybody so that people can access the podcast has been achieved. So super big thanks to everybody for that. And what that means now is we can start moving forward with the second goal for the Patreon, which is to start upping the archaic technology that I've been getting this podcast done on. So please head on over to the Patreon. It's at patreon.com/thehermitslamp, or there are links in the show notes. When you sign up, you will get access to extra material, such as short talks by me, and going forward, extra material with the various guests that I have on, which I will not be sharing anywhere, along with artwork and previews of my new tarot decks and other creations long before I share them anywhere else. So head on over and support. It's no joke, as they say, every dollar really does help. Thanks for listening.
So welcome to another episode of the Hermit Slam podcast. Today I am on the line with Al Cummings, and I've been following Al's work for some while now. I've been looking at his look at geomancy, and I've been following some of his work on saints and other things, as well as a bunch of collaborative projects that he's done with people who I hope will certainly be future guests of this show as well. But in case people are just coming to this fresh and don't know who you are, Al, why don't you give us a quick introduction?
Sure. Hello. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on. It's great to get to finally chat to you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
My background is kind of a one of those dual forking pincer movement things of academic training in the history of magic, which I did through the University of Leeds, and then did my doctorate at the University of Bristol under Professor Ronald Hutton about early modern British magic primarily, but some wider European influences as well. It's inevitable when you're talking about Renaissance magic that you're going to bring in, the big guns of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and things like that. So obviously there's a continental influence going on there. And my other, the other prong of that two-forked pincer movement is I've been a practitioner and a diviner and a consultant sorcerer for a number of years. And I love the interplay of the two, as I'm sure many of your listeners do as well. That false dichotomy that's often set up between those that just study and those that just do. And I've never met a serious magician who wasn't also someone who'd made a real effort to learn about his or her field and be up on the current academic research. Likewise, in academic conferences, it's often after a couple drinks, people are a lot more looser and more willing to talk about what they've actually tried and things like that. And so I like existing in that kind of grey place between being both a practitioner and a scholar of this stuff.
I think it's kind of one of the, maybe it's been a plague of every era, but I feel like it's especially a plague of the modern era or the time in which we find ourselves. Mm-hmm. This sort of duality or multiplicity between things, Mm. I remember trying, I periodically go through these sort of journeys of re-examining what I talk about, how I talk about that sort of bridge of divination, philosophy, psychology, and magic, and
right.
To me, they're indistinguishable from each other when we look at them as a whole, and we can draw lines in different places, and that can be functional. But to me, there's no division between doing a piece of magic and talking about somebody's psychology or thinking about somebody's psychology as it's involved. You know,
they certainly have to be mutually exclusive. And one of the things I like to riff on when we're talking about, I was asked recently at a talk whether or not I subscribed more to a spirit model or a psychological model. And I kind of did that classic attack the question thing of refusing to ally with one or the other, based off the fact that, psychology, psychiatry, these are both, as far as I'm aware, 15th century French terms. It is not anachronistic for us to look at the magic of the 16th and 17th centuries as being something that combined an understanding that there were spirits and there was also psychology, and that someone who was mentally unwell in some way, or had an impairment of mental or cognitive or emotional faculties, might also attract spirits who might haunt them. Likewise, the devil could work through, if you read these, heresiographies, could work through the agency of madness and induce it. And so, rather than producing this very simple set of straw men of either it's all in your head or it's all the actions of spirits or energy, or however you want to frame your model of quote unquote objective magic, big heavy scare quote fingers there, you are inevitably bringing in an aspect of both. So one of the most famous spiritual physicians, kind of a cunning man, certainly an astrologer physician, an angel summoner, and magician, Dr. Richard Napier of the mid-17th century, who was regarded as an expert in the impairments of mental faculties. People came from a long way away to work out whether, and it would ask him to work out whether or not the patient was possessed, haunted, under the influence of witchcraft or the ministrations of the devil himself, or was physically unwell, producing brain disease symptoms, or was mentally unwell after dealing with a trauma of some kind, or any combination of those factors, right? Mm-hmm. These were not mutually exclusive things. And in fact, often if you were suffering from one, you would probably start to develop the symptoms, at least, if not the underlying pathologies of the others as well. And so one of the ways Richard Napier worked around this was divination, through both astrology and geomancy, and also through summoning the Archangel Raphael, who he seems to have had a very, very close relationship with. And such a close relationship. On the one hand, people like William Lilly, one of the most famous astrologers of the 17th century, and John Aubrey, who was a sort of Fortean of his time, helped repopularize Stonehenge and things like that. Both of them visited Napier relatively frequently, apparently, or at least several times, and remarked that he, would go and had an angel closet of some kind, which was not an uncommon way of these practitioners to do their thing, apparently, and would, stand there and invoke angels for an hour or two, and then go and do his consultations. But the thing I like pointing out about Napier is that such was his close relationship with the Archangel Raphael that he would call up the medicine of God to do these kind of consults for him, or these referrals, and frequently disagree with the angel's diagnosis, which I love. This is not someone who is an iconoclast. He's not doing this to raise a middle finger to God or anything. He was regarded as an incredibly pious practitioner. But I think that's an interesting set of relationships in terms of how to navigate a spirit and psychological model, and also use spirits to investigate that, and to not necessarily believe everything of the signal that you are given, right? Or everything of the noise that you're given, to be able to discern which parts of that seem more sensible than others.
Well, I think that, there are a couple, there's a bunch of things in there that you say that are really interesting, but let's talk about the first one first, which is, I think that it's something that is unfortunate that it doesn't seem very common these days, is this sort of capacity to differentiate or understand the distinction between what might be spirit purely, as you say, it's a muddle, right? Mm-hmm. But what parts of it, or in what ways might we be able to discern, is this a spirit caused situation? Is right. This a psychiatric caused, or mm-hmm. all these other models that you talked about, and it's one of those things where I remember working with clients and sort of receiving instructions from the spirits that I work with about how to interpret what I see as their energy in ways that would point between these different pieces, right? And people who have this certain kind of energy pattern, you know, they would more often than not have this sort of more psychiatric issues or so on.
Yeah.
Unless they were like super hardcore meditators and really, really evolved, at which point those patterns would kind of merge, you know, which was very interesting to me. You know?
That's fascinating.
There might be ways in which people had, you know, like people talk about premature Kundalini awakenings or, you know, other kinds of things that there are these states that might be helpful later on, but which when they emerge unbidden or they emerge alongside other kinds of things just cause tremendous problems, you know?
Right. And that's interesting from a perspective of a consultant and a diviner for someone, and for clients especially, where, you know, you have identified the pattern of energies at work. It's now often, I find, your job to find a way that's useful, right? Which I think is, you know, or sometimes the useful thing is to say that would be a decision that would end in rack and ruin. It doesn't look like it's going to help you, right? Or it's, I mean, I read with Geomancy very often for clients. I primarily read playing cards and Geomancy these days. And there are figures that can fall that portray danger, deceit, the potential for addictive behaviors, and a variety of other overly impassioned vice kind of like problems. And it's the figure is rubeous and refers to the spilling of blood. It's considered bad for all things except that which requires bloodshed. Now, that means from a medieval, early modern perspective, it was good for phlebotomy, and it could occasionally be useful for voiding ill humors through that bloodletting stuff. And there are kind of some equivalences that you can find, like nowadays, other kinds of, it can recommend going to see your doctor, that kind of thing. But finding a way for Rubeus to do something useful in a chart, if it's spilling something, you know, I have before now found myself having to take a bottle of red wine to a crossroads and upend that as a means of like placating a spirit or working through a set of very martial energies and workings for that to be useful. That set of virtues, that pattern was present once the divination confirmed it, and especially with the attendant spirit contact around it, it was also bringing that thing in, right? And so finding a way that's useful in some way, to be either the thing that is subject to it or the thing that is enacting it in the world, finding a way for that violence in this case to be useful in some way, to break an old pattern or to, you know, stand up to someone or any number of those other things.
So when people come to you for a geomancy reading, are they people who are going about their lives and are just inclined towards divination? Or do you find that it's people who are sort of inclined towards more, for lack of a better word, sort of esoteric or kind of cult and philosophical kind of, you know, approaches to life already?
Yeah, I wonder that myself sometimes. I think a materialist overculture, if I can, you know, briefly jump on a soapbox, produces a statistical slide towards people who are already aware of magic and that, you know, think it's worth paying a professional to divine for them. So often there's someone with some kind of practice or some kind of set of beliefs, or even just, you know, have witnessed things happening or have had experiences that lead them to suggest that there's something valid for them in this. I get a range of people. I get some people who are, you know, some of my clients are, you know, classic people seeking divination at a crossroads in their life, you know, recently divorced or wanting to change career or wanting to do something different at that crossroads. I also work with a lot of artists and event coordinators and things like that to plan events and ritual and ceremony and works of art as well. And it's something that I like to point out to people who are new to the idea of a professional diviner or consultant being someone that would be useful to have on board a project, which is that this doesn't have to be, in much the same way that other magicians talk about magical work, doesn't have to be triage, doesn't have to be, oh God, emergency, I need to, pay my rent or something. Those are valid things to get het up about and to need to deal with. But so much better is prevention than cure, right?
Not to say that we might not find ourselves in a martial sign that requires some kind of bloodletting or other kind of, easing. But if we're on top of it on the regular,
right.
When the thermometer starts to rise, we can deal with it then before it kind of gets too high, right?
Yeah. And so, I find divination and consultation something that I end up doing for people who are not necessarily looking to massively change their lives as much as enrich them, right? It's not just people who are unhappy, and it's certainly not just people who are desperate, which I think is also a little kind of, it's a bugbear of mine that the idea that you would only ever consult, a card reader or a professional astrologer if you were like desperate in some way. And I think that's a very unfair characterization of people. Most, the vast majority of my clients are people who take their divination very seriously, who employ it in a very mature and responsible manner in order to have better, to rather than abnegate responsibility, to take that responsibility on more. And that's, the role of a diviner, right? Is someone that can help someone chart the hauling coherence of influences around them and empower them further to be able to make better decisions and live their better life, right?
And especially, to kind of come full circle here, if the people are dealing with a muddle of unknown problems and consequences, from spirits to mental health to physical health to whatever, being able to sort that out, if the person is willing to take ownership of that and work with it and go from there. That can be one of the most profound things ever, right?
Absolutely.
You can remove the spiritual influence, and then what you're left with, while still no small thing, is then adjustable by other realms, or other practices.
Yeah.
It's quite wonderful, and sometimes knowing even just, knowing that it's in fact none of those, it's like, hey, you know what, this is not a spiritual thing.
Right.
Don't come back for this. You're good.
Yeah.
That in itself is quite a liberation, because it gives an answer, even if it's, then it leaves other questions, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's also, one of the things about divination as diagnostic technique is that it's bespoke, right? It's for that individual at that particular time in their lives with these particular choices and influences and patterns of virtue around them, right? So it's by necessity a site-specific, time-specific, person-specific thing. It deals with, there is a ritual that is going on between diviner and client there. You are locating the client as a locus about which these forces are present, right? And in naming them, we are also kind of bringing them to the light in some way and apprehending them in some way. And that hopefully becomes useful as well. And this is especially useful when diagnosis becomes not just prognosis, but also an attempt at treatment and remediation, magically speaking, which is something that I think is very important. Is not just telling someone, this is the nature of your circumstances and conditions, good luck with that, and signing out, so much as saying, okay, well, this is the difficulty in your career path at the moment. Let's see whether we can boost the positive influences that say that, yes, there is a path for you in this career, for instance, for that kind of question. And also let us try and address this issue here in the 10th house with your current boss, who is clearly attempting to undermine you in some way, right? So you can look at both the negative factors and attempt to rebalance them or address them, or secure the positive factors of a reading as well. And I think it's very easy for us to jump immediately on our, cleansing baths and things like that when a reading comes up negatively. And as well we should, but to kind of not think we need to do anything if a reading suggests that there is a good path ahead. And something I sometimes recommend is, if you get a really great reading, you should secure that in some way, right? You should nail that thing down and keep that good luck in your pocket in some way.
Well, it's like in cowrie shell divination in sort of the divinations within the Orisha traditions, right? They say that the ire, the form of blessing that can arise, that it is that it can be tremendously fleeting, right? And that in fact, when we see that come, when we see that there are blessings, and especially if they're sort of predicted firmly and there's nothing else to do about it, well, the thing to do about it is still to be like diligent and tend it and pay attention to it, and maybe make offerings even though they weren't specifically asked for, or to do things to really hold that and sustain that, because it can turn to negativity so simply and so easily, and then it's very hard to get it back where it was before. So it's this notion that success is permanent or solid is seems really kind of dubious to me at best.
Right. It's not this carrot that gets dangled in front of you that says if you just put in another 5 years at something you don't like, then eventually you will have made it, and that will be the solid state, unending success of a pre-death bliss. Right. It's a nonsense. Yeah. We constantly have to fight for our blessings and to secure them. And what was that beautiful, obviously it was terribly sad that Ursula Le Guin passed recently, but it did mean that people were sharing a lot of her work and her quotes. And that one about love seems particularly relevant here. Love does not sit there like a stone. It must be remade constantly like bread, right? The idea of constantly having to keep up the good things, the effort to enjoy the things in life and to enjoy each other.
Yeah, it never ends, right?
Right.
Well, eventually it ends, but then it really ends. So the other thing that you mentioned earlier when we were talking was this idea of arguing with spirits. This person who would argue with the with the angels and so on, right? And I think that it's such an important thing for people to consider, right? Especially, whether we're talking about ancestors or whether we're talking about angels or, anything else or in between or wherever other ways, I think that sort of being open to wrestling with them about things and, tussling out what is true or what's the real deal, and I don't mean like in the goetic way, like, no, I'm not going to give you that, I'm only going to give you this. Don't take advantage of me. But just, I know that there are times, in like spiritual masses or with one of my guides in particular, where she'll come down with a message and I'm like, dude, I'm not saying that. There's no way I'm saying it that way,
Right.
And yet people, I think that, there's lots of ways in which people believe that they should, pass this along as like a pure testament of truth or, unequivocal gold of the situation, right?
Yeah, the idea that being a channel for spirit means that you don't have to worry about tact or bedside manner or, offending people, that you are speaking a profound and unquestionable universal truth. I'm obviously a bit dubious of that, especially in divination. Certainly, I can share the experience of having a familiar spirit that helps me divine, that says things in my ear in ways that I definitely wouldn't say to a client. Very blunt, shall we say, if not mean occasionally.
Yeah.
Also savagely accurate to her credit. But yes, so that again is a job of a diviner, right? To demonstrate that tact and that clarity that allows the best way for the medicine to be administered, right? The medicine of the consultation, the medicine of the regimen that might emerge from that, the story medicine of like, this is how your current situation looks, the potential medicines of this is what you could do about it. And again, to evangelize about geomancy, for instance, one of the things that we can do is not just look at the client or the person asking the question, the querent in the first house. We can also look to a couple of different houses, depending on the exact nature of the context of the consultation, for how the diviner, how you are being perceived. And crucially, through those two things, you can then work out one of the best ways. You can look at how the client will take your advice. You can look at how you can phrase it, you know, and so you can read a chart and have attendant, you know, spirit guides saying you're going to need to phrase this very gently. This client is not going to be able to take you, you know, speaking plainly about this thing. Likewise, sometimes it's clear that you have to be incredibly blunt, and that's what will be most useful. And if you aren't, then the client will jump on the one detail that they wanted to hear and ignore the other ones. And that is in part, it's very easy to complain about like quote unquote bad clients, but that's also something that I think diviners need to take a little bit of responsibility for. It's not just your job to plonk a message down in front of someone. It's also your job to, I think, help them unpack it and make it available and useful and something that they can actually apprehend and engage with.
Yeah, I also think that it can be part of the job of being a professional diviner to sort out and be clear with yourself. Who do you not work well with, right?
Right.
You know, who do you just not like? Who do you not like? What situations do you not want to, you know, deal with, right? Like, you know, where are your strengths and weaknesses, you know? And not in a, like, you know, a mean-spirited or even judgmental way, but like, you know, there are certain kinds of situations where, for whatever reasons, I have no slack for that. And if the person comes up with that, I might read for them, but I'm definitely not going to get magically involved in it because my attention and my energy doesn't flow well in those because of that, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that we as diviners can take way more agency in the process than I sometimes see people taking, you know?
Yeah, I think so.
So the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, though, the thing that I was curious about that's been sort of on my mind of what we would get to when we were on the show was, so there's this great big revival from what I see, of working with saints these days. You know, and I see like lots of people in the various spiritual and occult communities kind of going back to working with saints and sort of having a magical relationship with them and those kinds of things. And, you know, you're definitely one of the people out there doing that work, right? Were the saints always your companions, or some saints? Was it a thing that you rediscovered? How did that happen for you?
That's a great question. I did not grow up practicing Catholic. My family are Irish Catholic by birth lottery, as they would put it. And certainly in my house, my folks are these days kind of agnostic, but certainly when I was growing up, fiercely, devoutly socialists, atheists. But as a result of the kind of family that I grew up in, we would be taken around an awful lot of churches and historical houses and manor houses and national trust properties and that kind of thing. Partly so that my father could sit there or stand there and ask, you know, how many workers do you think died to build this structure? So my early engagement with high churches and that kind of stuff was very much a sense of like, there are a lot of dead people underlying this thing that still exists. And that certainly, I think, still informed how I approach saint work in terms of, or saint devotion, I should say, really, in terms of how long it's been an active part of my practice. Was certainly learning from my great-grandmother before she passed that there was a set of Irish naming traditions in the family, that there was a particular reason why your middle name is Joseph, Al, because you're named after your Uncle Harry, whose middle name was also Joseph, is an example of this kind of thing that was done. It's like the whole idea of firstborn will be called this, secondborn will be this, thirdborn will be this. But then we also include what happens when they aren't all male and a variety of other circumstances. So there were naming traditions I discovered. And in attempting to understand my great-grandmother, who was a remarkable woman in terms of being a tiny little Irish Catholic lady, we no idea exactly how old she was. Her father bribed the village clerk to lie about her age so that she could come over to England and train as a nurse earlier. So we're not entirely sure how old she was. But she was a devout Irish Catholic, set the table for dead relatives occasionally, certainly spoke about them like they were there, and also taught pranayama yoga for about 45, 50 years. I was a very early adopter of that in Wolverhampton in the UK. So she was an interesting and odd lady, and so certainly trying to understand her through her these two practices of like a rich, dense energy kind of work and breath work stuff and all the things that pranayama is, and this intense devotion. She would talk about. I'd ask her, how do you square these things, and she'd say, well, I just don't tell the priest. That's not his business. I make sure I'm doing my breathing next to a pillar, so if I do pass out, then I won't cause a fuss.
Uh-huh.
And I do
wake up eventually, so it'll be all right.
Yeah, exactly. And I see a sanctifying mass and this opening effect of that, and I want to be as receptive as I can to that. So I open myself up as much as I can, and then I zip myself back up, and I go about my day. And so that was very inspiring to me. And my earliest sort of set of actually practicing things rather than just reading Crowley or whatever else was chaos magic. And so that idea of not all having to fit into one cosmology, that you could do several things, and that there wasn't even a negative capability of that you could have a practice. You could be a Catholic who did pranayama. Obviously you can do those things. But the idea of mixing spiritual traditions, or at least parallel practice of them, was an influence. I think the first set of things that I ended up doing more formally in terms of what felt like magic rather than what just felt like, going to a St. Stephen's church and, enjoying the peace and quiet and taking on the aspect of seeking calm and that kind of thing. The first sort of work that was like, all right, I have this saint in front of me and these incenses and an intention that I'm trying to work a spell with them was Cyprian. I went on a little pilgrimage to a particularly famous hoodoo candle store in California, and came in and was just beginning my doctorate, and so asked, what would you advise of the owner? What would you advise that I take on in terms of a candle or a spell? I wasn't shopping around for a patron. I was just wanting to work a particular thing, an academic success kind of ongoing working. And, she asked, well, what is it that you're doing? What's the nature of this research? And after I'm telling her it's about the history of magic, she's just, well, obviously you should be buying this Cyprian candle, and this is how you can work it, and fixed it in front of me and showed me some of the bits and pieces and sold me a couple of other things as well. But that was the start of a relationship that's only deepened, where and a variety of things occurred after that. Again, saint work is very tied to ancestor work for me, and certainly the dreams I had after I started working with Cyprian of ancestors coming to me, proud that I was finally working with a nice Catholic saint, despite his hideous reputation and rightly, and justifiably so. He's not necessarily someone whose earlier history or career is particularly admirable or something that you would want to repeat in terms of, selling the equivalent of roofies. But nevertheless, they were delighted that I was even engaging with this stuff at all on a more formal level. And that for me was one of the big, along with the fact that, when I took things to him, they worked out the way I wanted them to, or they worked out for my benefit, along with offering me a set of challenges of things to work on, of things to work through, was also how it bolstered my connection to my ancestors. And
I find it interesting how, so there's the baseline layer, like, hey, I need more money, or hey, I want success at my, in my academic career, or, I'm hoping to have a baby, or whatever the things are that people, want and need that they go to saints for. But at the same time, I feel like you really kind of hit on something there, which is sort of the unexpected second level of that process, which is, you go to them and they're like, yeah, sure, give me a candle and I'll do this thing for you, no problem, right? But if you stick around with them for a while, then they start like working on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
They start tinkering with you in a way to bring out some kind of evolution or change or growth, or it's certainly been my experience, right?
Yeah, and I think this is especially the case when you start taking on a saint not just as someone that helps you in a particular aspect of your life, but as a patron of your arguably your main career, or even of all of your magic. And that's certainly, Cyprian is one of those for me, is someone I go to for any work I do, for a client or for myself. And when you allow a patron when you allow yourself space in the container to allow a patron to hold space for helping you make decisions about things that aren't just, this is the saint I go to for money work, right? If you have a relationship with that saint in other aspects of your life, if you're going to them about asking for the clarity to be able to make a useful decision about, a new relationship that's just started or something like that, you're giving them more space to be able to help you, right? You're opening up more roads, if you want to phrase it like that, for them to, like you say, start working on you in ways.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating and a powerful way to go. And I think it's really helpful. And I also noticed that a lot of people are very uncomfortable with being that open with spirits, and with having that level of dialogue about everything that's going on in their life with spirits, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's, there can be a very sort of transactional, relationship that people have, like, I'll give you this, you give me that. But even if it's relational, there's this sort of, I don't know if it's a legacy of parenting issues in the West or whatever, but there's a sort of, well, you know what, but but they don't get to tell me how to live my life, right? It's like,
yeah.
Do they not? Is that what's going on? Like, I think about that with the Orishas, right? Do they tell me how to live my life? Not in the way people mean it, right? But certainly in a way that most people would be relatively uncomfortable with. I'm going to hear their advice and do my best to live it all the time, because the space in the container that I have with them allows for that, and allows and makes things happen that otherwise would never happen separately. If I was stuck in my head or my sense of self too strongly.
Yeah, for sure. And being able to discern what your head is wanting and what is useful for your life path is some deep stuff, right? And is going to require a different engagement than, how do I solve this current immediate problem, right? How do I live my best life is a different question, and requires my experience of being involved for a couple of years in Lukumi Orisha worship is that it's a very different ball game in terms of it's an established tradition with an actual priestcraft of actual work and learning, and that's not to say that other traditions don't also have those things, but the level of commitment and of taking on good advice and attempting to live it every day, right, is a really important thing, and something that other traditions, when they do well, do very well as well. But that if we're talking Orisha, that's been certainly my experience, is that that closeness is also, rewarded with the calm and the coolness and the development of good character that we're attempting to achieve to leave the marketplace of the world in a better place than it was when we got here, before we go back home to heaven.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that, it's also interesting that, again, it's sort of part of the, legacy of modern thinking in some ways, this sort of idea that a saint or a spirit might only kind of govern one limited aspect. And while I think that that's certainly true of certain classes of spirits, that their spectrum of influence or their, from a human point of view, is limited, and we might want to keep it there.
Sure.
This sort of relationships with saints and things like that, this idea that we could be open to messages that are not necessarily within their, official textbook definition wheelhouse,
Right,
is also very fascinating. I started working with Saint Expedite a long time ago. It's kind of part of my bridge from ceremonial stuff into African diasporic traditions, as a sort of a syncretism for other spirits. And then when I finally sort of landed in my Orisha tradition and sort of removed all my stepping stones that had gotten me there, Saint Expedite was the only one who stayed, and he was like, no, dude, I'm not leaving. I'm with you now. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't quite catch that distinction as it was going on. And then, but by way of sort of the differences, he sort of wasn't prominent, wasn't really working with him for like 15 years or something like that. Just had my pieces tucked away amongst my relics of other times and things that I don't do much of anymore. And then all of a sudden I came across this painting I had done of him, and he was like, dude, I'm out. You got to put me out now. This is it. And the messages that I got from him were all about my artwork and not about sort of ceremony and spirits or working with the dead or, other things like that. And so it was this very interesting thing where he came forward with this message that is not entirely incongruous with his nature per se, but certainly not where I would think to start with,
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here looking at him as we're talking, and he's kind of nodding his head like, that's right, dude. That's it.
I love that. That's beautiful. The idea of some particular aspect of your life that they would manifest their advice and their power in, that isn't, that you're not going to read in some, in some encyclopedia of saints or the Golden Legend or some Botanica pamphlet. That's something that you've come to yourself. It reminds me of the way people sometimes talk about plant allies as well. And I think this is a wider aspect of what we mean by spirit patronage, right? That spirit might be, you might get on famously and become, fast friends, and that plant might then be willing to work in ways that, again, aren't in the encyclopedias of herb magic or Cunningham or any of those other things. Isn't keyworded that like this plant that you work with every day and consider a patron of your green craft and of your life in general would do a thing that might be unusual, might be added to a bath or a charm bag or something that wasn't typically included in that kind of thing. That's certainly a relationship I have with rosemary, where beyond its its noted capacity for memory and its necromantic value and its purifying and asperging uses, I have in the past had definite spirit contact to say you should include me in this bath for something completely different, because I am one of your because I want to be involved in this and I can further empower it. And confirming that through divination as well, which I think is also something that gets underreported, is that, again, spirit contact and non-rational ways of knowing and spirit communication can also be facilitated by computational divination. You can still throw your sticks, your shells, your things to confirm that is the spirit saying that thing, and it's not either you or some other spirit or some other option of things. And so in confirming that, I was putting rosemary in everything for a while,
Sure.
Because it was standing up and saying like, yeah, I can do this too. I can do this too. I can do this too.
Yeah. I've had a similar experience with burdock, where people, especially with sending people to work with it, because here in Toronto, it's prevalent everywhere at a certain point in the year. It takes over everything, and you know, that energy will be like, yeah, tell them to come and collect some of this part of me and do this thing with it, and I'll help them in this way. Or, you know, I remember somebody was trying to let go of some childhood stuff, and the plant basically came in and said, yeah, tell them to come and find the biggest one around and dig up my whole root, and when they're done, they'll be healed. And it took them a long time, you know. They're big and spreading. But it was profound, and it was transformative for that person by their report. So there are many ways in which that can happen. But also, as you say, that verifying it, you know, whatever your divination tools for verification, or checking with a spirit that you have more concrete mechanisms with, or whatever. I think that's so important, because, you know, this sort of free will and idea that I can just sort of intuit anything and that could be the answer. It's like, well, maybe, possibly, but, you know, I get very twitchy about that at times, because stuff starts to come out, you know, where it's like, well, yeah, but you know what? That's actually not a good idea in these other ways, or this is kind of toxic, or kind of, you know.
Yeah, and that's where exactly, and that's where using a divination technique that is definite, that is computational, that is like, no, that card says this thing, isn't like you know, a fudge, it isn't like a coin on its side, but also computational, but also that provides qualified answers. So not just flipping a coin of like yes or no, is this what the spirit said, but you know, a 3-card throw that allows for, you know, 2 reds and a black, meaning yes but, right, or 2 blacks and a red, meaning no but, right, which allows not just the confirmation of the thing that you think you're receiving, but also allows the spirit to give you extra information as well, to say, yes, you heard me right about that stuff, but you also need to check this other thing that you haven't checked, or no, that's not what I said, but you are on the right track in terms of this direction. It's not just about a gatekeeping of like which images and which contact gets in and which doesn't, but also you are continually negotiating and allowing yourself to have more space to hear a more nuanced transmission.
Yeah, and I think the idea of developing nuance is just so important, right? I mean, whatever divination tool you're looking at, you know, I think that this idea that we could sort of have a, you know, in the same way, it's the exact same way as we're talking about the saints, right? When you have a real relationship with your divination system, it's conveying information that goes well beyond, you know, yes or no, or even kind of like, yeah, it's pretty good or not good. There are so many other pieces that start to emerge from the practice and the getting to know those things that then facilitate the shaping of it, right?
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, that can be a sign that you're making deeper engagement with a saint, is when they start coming out with stuff that you haven't read somewhere, right? That you haven't, and that's not licensed for everyone to be, you know, oh, well, I dress expedite in pink, and, you know, I never offer in pound cake. And that's not an excuse to throw away tradition, but that is a sign where, if you're working respectfully, most traditions have a notion that, like, there's going to be idiosyncrasies, there's going to be particularities and personalizations, both in terms of how the spirit works with you and how you work with the spirit, right? And most
variations by geography and culture, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I grew up with nothing religiously, you know, like nobody considered it, nobody was for it, nobody was against it. You know, people were sort of like vaguely, slightly, a little bit mystic at times, but there was kind of nothing. You know, and so like the first time I remember going to church was when I was like 11, and my parents had separated, and we lived in a small town, and my mom was trying to find some community, so we went to the Anglican church. But you know, I didn't have any connection to any of those things. So, you know, and never mind if I was from like a totally different culture than sort of a Western culture or something else and engaging with this. You know, they might just be like, you know what, you don't have pound cake, but you got this other thing that I'll take. That looks good. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
And this is especially the case when you're looking at quote unquote folk practices. You know, what people who weren't rich did and continue to do in many parts of the world. That, you know, that San Rocco, that Saint Roche, isn't, doesn't behave like the one 4 villages down. One of them is more about warding off plague because he warded off a plague once or several times, right? Yeah. And the other might be more about bringing in the harvest because that's, that's the famine that he avoided by being petitioned, right? And successfully performed a miracle. And so that terroir of spirit work, that sense that like this particular place dealt with either this aspect of that spirit that was called the same thing that they call it down the road, or a different spirit sharing that name, or however it ends up shaking out, whatever your ontology of the situation seems to suggest. That's super important. Yeah, that you're not necessarily dealing with a wrong way of working with them so much as a different way. But that again is not something that emerges from just wandering through, reading 777 and deciding that you're going to cook up a bunch of stuff, right, over a nice cup of tea. That's the result of many hands working for a very long time and requiring something done about an immediate danger. And certainly I'm thinking of San Rocco in southern Italy, Because if the saint don't work, it gets thrown in the sea, or,
for sure, right?
or put in front of the volcano.
Yeah, and that's always an interesting thing to consider, right? I mean, we can make a thought form or whatever we want to call it. We can create spiritual energies to accomplish certain things, but this sort of depth and the history of energy, prayer, offering, and kind of the lineage of different places, like the saint in that village versus the saint in this village.
Right.
I think that those create something very different over time, and whether that all comes from the same source or whatever we choose to believe, that is another matter. But
right.
But this sort of idea that that if we're going to work with somebody in a certain way, like if we want St. Rocco to do this thing versus that thing, that we might want to take a bit more of that other town's approach, or see what are the differences in practices that might help call that energy out in that way.
For sure.
Right?
For sure.
Not unlike singing certain songs in the Orisha tradition, or playing certain beats or making certain offerings, bring out different faces of the spirits, right? There are the way in which we approach them and what we give them is also part of their process and channel of manifesting that opens up these different capacities in a different way,
Right. And crucially, you're dealing with diaspora as well. You're dealing with how does a tradition or a set of traditions try and remember not just its own thing, but remember the traditions of their brothers and sisters, right? Who are, can sometimes no longer remember where it is they're from, right? And that's a really important thing. Is it isn't just, I don't know, fatuous example, the Allegro of like Brooklyn, doesn't receive toasted corn. He asks for like Pabst Blue Ribbon or whatever, right? This isn't something that you can just like decide or think you've had an experience out without confirming any of this with any of the initiated priests of that tradition, right? Likewise, the diaspora of, say, again, to continue that example, because it's one I'm more familiar with through the work of my wife in Italian folk magic, of San Rocco in South Italy. There are different expressions of him in the New World. There's a very long running procession through New York's Little Italy. That's one of the most celebratory saint festivals I've ever been to over here. Sometimes I'm sure you've had similar experiences, that even a saint that is considered holy and happy has a kind of somberness, especially when we're celebrating their martyrdom. Whereas, the San Rocco Festival in New York is a joy. There are confetti cannons. It's delightful, but it's also very reverent. Certainly the central confraternity do it barefoot and make a real effort that it's a community event and those kinds of things. And that's where modifications come in as well. That's where traditions develop and grow and live and breathe and stretch, is in actually interacting with a new land and with different communities and kinds of people. And those are where, like, oh, we couldn't get this kind of wine, so we got this other kind of wine. Those kinds of things like substitutions, as I understand it, start to come in. But it's something that occurs from within, stretching out. It's not something that can be, with that etic-emic thing. It's not something that an outsider can then take something of and claim anything like the same sort of lineage and the same kind of oomph, the same kind of cachet, the same kind of virtue or grace moving through that thing.
We can't claim substitutions because it's hard to get that thing or whatever, right?
Right.
I mean, they only really take off when it's required. But I'm going to tell you right now, and everybody else listening, if there's ever a procession for me, I would like it to have confetti cannons with it. That definitely is a part of a cult that I would like to found. So let's make that happen somehow.
For sure, good to stick around and be useful.
Yeah,
that's
fun. So we're kind of reaching the end of our time here, but I also wanted to touch on your new book, which is out. Yes. So the Three Magi, right? Why? Tell me why, what is it about them that draws you? Why did you write this book? Where did it come from?
It came from, that's an amazing question. There are a couple of things. One is that I have a very central part of my practice that is about working with dead magicians and working with the attendant spirits around them, and a kind of necromancy of necromancy, if we want to put it like that, from specific techniques to a kind of lineage ancestor sense, from the fact that my doctorate was handed to me by handshake by someone who had hands laid on them, who had hands laid on them, back to the founding of the charter, and having a sense of that, the spiritual lineage of academic doctors, and in studying the dead magicians of the 17th century, for instance, and how they were interested in say, Elias Ashmole, interested in forming this kind of lineage of English magic that feels a little bit Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell at times, to be honest.
Sure.
So I've been interested in dead magicians for a while and had found them kind of turning up in my practice and helping me do my history of them. They were very invested in how they were being portrayed, funnily enough. And the Magi became a locus, a way in which I, as someone that wasn't necessarily, certainly from the outside, looking like I was living a terribly good, pious, early modern Christian life, could be talking to these Christian magicians. It was a way of framing where we all appreciate the Magi, right? Who are both, and that's another fascinating point. Like Cyprian, arguably more so than Cyprian, they're both Christian and not, right? They are the first Gentiles to make this pilgrimage. They're utterly essential to the nativity narrative. They're also, they're also categorically astrologers and probably Babylonian, and drawing on a variety of older traditions, certainly around Alexander the Great and his invasions into various different regions, mirror some of the kinds of mythic beats of their story, of the Magi story. Mm-hmm. So there was this sense of, I was already working with dead magicians. I was interested in the role of magic in the traditions and saint devotion and things that I was already exploring. And I've always been attracted to liminal spirits and found working with them very helpful, the ones that exist on a threshold between things, the cemetery gates, the wall between two things, the border crosses, if you like. And their unique status as a cult is also interesting as well, in that by the 14th century, certainly they are considered saints, Saint Caspar, Saint Melchior, and Saint Balthasar. But they're also utterly important to that tradition, but kind of outside of it, but also legitimizing it. And certainly this is how their cult played out from the vast popularity of their pilgrimage site in Cologne, which became one of the four major hubs of pilgrimage, which was a big deal, right, in the medieval period. into the exploration into the so-called New World, where again the kings were employed by both colonizers. There was a concept of pre-conquest evangelization, the idea that the good message of the Nazarene had extended to the quote-unquote savages of the Americas, which is why the Mayans had crosses, supposedly. That they had civilizations, so they must know about Christianity, because that's the only civilization that builds. That's the only culture that could allow a civilization to occur. And so this frames the conquest of the New World as, again, the quote-unquote New World, as a matter of reminding people that they were already Christian. And one of the ways that this was done was to tell colonized people that one of the kings who came from afar was from them, and that thus their king had already acquiesced to the will of these white colonizers, or these European colonizers. But in doing that, they also allowed colonized and sometimes actually enslaved people a sense of like autonomy, that they had a magician king ancestor, that even though that was being annexed on the one hand, it also fomented political dissent. And so that notion of a powerful and politically ambiguous set of figures became really, really interesting to me. It also, in terms of personal anecdotes, they also became more significant when I moved to Bristol and I was touring as a performance poet and a consultant magician and diviner. And I was getting cheap transport a lot because I was also a student, and I was getting the megabus, if you're familiar with that, and it stopped just outside of one of the only chapels dedicated to the Three Kings in Europe, which happens to be in Bristol. And so I would see them every day as I was setting out on a journey. And so I started looking for them in grimoires, and finding that most of the spells that are considered under their aegis or their patronage are works of safe travel, right? Are works of journeying, right? Of going, of adoring, and then returning via a different way, right? And that model has greatly inspired me. I mean, directly in terms of the work I was doing, working with the land I had and the places I had and the opportunities I had to make quick offerings when I needed to, make sure I was nursing a nasty hangover on a 5-hour journey up to, go and do a gig somewhere. But also, getting off the bus at the end of journeys and saying thank you, and gathering dirts and using that in that way. And certainly that idea of them being patrons, not just of where you pilgrimaged to, but the patrons of pilgrims themselves, feels very powerful to me. And that sense of them, that we don't pray to them, that we pray like them, also feels to me very much like an important necromantic aspect of the ancestor cults around them, that we imitate them, that we too are on a journey looking for the light that points to majesty of some kind, whatever that is. That we too are on a journey in terms of passing from life to death and maybe to return, right? To be a bit mystic about it. I find it very interesting that occasionally the Magi, or lithographs of the Magi and the star, find their ways into or are venerated in some houses of Haitian Vodou, right, where they refer to the Simbi and that notion of spirits that have died and then died again and crossed over again to become spirits of some kind. And that mass of the idea of not simply working with a saint who is that thing, that you are working with the elevated soul of someone that used to wander around in a human body and is now, in theory, sat at the right hand of God, right? You're also working, or you can also work with an attendant set of dead folk who cohere around that point of devotion because they also worshipped like that. And that's, again, that sense of like ancestral saint work for me is very important. Not just what icon am I staring at, but what spirits, what shades do I feel around me who are also facing that direction, right? And who am I in communion with, and who am I sharing that communion with?
I love it. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why people use the term spiritual court, right?
Yeah.
Or who are we all, whose court are we at, and who are we all, lining up with in that place, and so on.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for making the time today, Al. I really dig it.
Yeah. No, it's been great.
You should definitely check out Al's book. We have it at the shop. It's available in other places too. And if people want to come and hang out with you on the internet, where should they go looking for you, Al?
Oh, they can find me at my website, which is www.alexandercummins.com. There's my blogs there. There's a bunch of free lectures. You can book my consultation services through that. You can jump on the mailing lists to hear about gigs I'm doing in wherever it is I am. Touring around a bit more these days, which is lovely to be on the road. Just got back from New Orleans, which was great to see God Family there, and also to do some great talks. I really enjoyed. My website. I also have an archive of pre-modern text scans of texts, grimoires on tape. .tumblr.com. If people want to check out, any of these texts from 17th century magicians that I've been kind of bigging up, that's certainly something I'm encouraging people to do is do that. I teach courses through my good friends at Wolf and Goat, Jesse and Troy. I've just finished a second run of the Geomancy Foundation course that I run, and I'll be setting up to do a course introducing humoral theory and approaches to the elements and that kind of embodied medical and magical kind of practice stuff, which hopefully diviners and people like that will be interested in. One of these underlying things for a lot of Western occult philosophy and magical practice that doesn't necessarily get looked at a lot. And so
perhaps something for us to have a further conversation about at some point.
I'd love that. Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks again, Al. And I really appreciate it.
Oh, great. No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.
So thanks as always for listening. I definitely appreciate everybody who takes the time to tune in to these podcasts, and especially those people who send me all sorts of kind words and thoughtful feedback about what we're doing here. I really appreciate it. If you are inspired by what's going on, please consider supporting us by going to the Patreon, link in the show notes, and or also by reviewing us on iTunes to help people find us more easily, or just sharing this in your social media feed, maybe even with a little sentence as to why people might enjoy it and take the time to listen to it. Thanks for helping spread the word. Thanks for helping make this happen. Thanks for being out there to share all this good stuff with.